Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast welcomes George Gilder, the founder of Gilder Technology Group and best-selling author of many books, including The Israel Test, How Israel's Genius Enriches and Challenges the World. And George Gilder, thanks for joining us on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
I'm delighted. Thank you.
So we should tell people, what is the Israel Test?
Well, it's how you respond to people who excel you in intellect, achievement, wealth, invention, art, that Jews have excelled all other peoples for the last several centuries, with a climax in the 20th century with Jews winning the Second World War through the Manhattan Project, and then launching Israel, and Israel becoming the leading country in the world's leading economy by my measurement. Its per capita income, which is understated, is ahead of Germany, Great Britain, South Korea, China, Japan. The Jews excel. So really, the Israel test is how you respond to excellence. A lot of people believe that the good fortune of others comes at the expense of somebody else, that we have a limited world, scarce resources, and if one group gets rich, somebody else has to get poor. And that's the opposite of the case. And so the Israel test really is a test whether we're going to enjoy prosperity and an abundant future, or whether we're going to see about the successes of others.
I'd like to talk at least briefly about the makeup of Israel, because a lot of people just are not familiar with the history of this rather new nation going to 1948. Who came there and why did they come to Israel?
You know, the long biblical history of Israel is known, but the recent history of Israel really began with the pogroms in Europe in the mid-19th century. And when the Jews first came to Israel, it was a desert. And there were only about between 200 and 300,000 Arabs in the Palestine area. And those 200, 300,000 Arabs had lifespans about 35 years. Jordan was a far bigger, more populous country than Palestine. Jews made desert bloom, made all kinds of inventions in desalinization and drip irrigation. They planted millions of trees. They purchased land at a price higher than Southern California, made Israel a country where Arabs could immigrate. Some 5 million Arabs immigrated to Palestine as a result of incredible feats of the Israelis in agriculture and energy, and made Israel a magnet for people all over the Middle East.
This took place in such a relatively short time. It's almost nothing short of a miracle to consider where Israel came from, the state of the land in particular, when they took it over.
In a speech I gave years ago about Israel and its technology. I discovered Israel chiefly through its technology. I'm a writer about microchips and electronics and telecommunications, life after Google, life after television, life after telecosm, all those kind of books. After one of my speeches, people lined up to have me sign the books. He brought me this little volume by a man named Walter Loudermilk, and I'd never heard of it. It was an obscure volume, but Walter Loudermilk was commissioned to travel the world by the U.S. Department of Agriculture during the Dust Bowl in the United States, when we really had a climate catastrophe in the West. Our agriculture was blighted, and Roosevelt sent Loudermilk around the world in 1937 to find out the solution. And he went all over the place, from China to India, everywhere, looking for ways farmers could deal with these terrible conditions, and finally arrived in Israel. And he was just astonished. In this book, it really was a report for the Department of Agriculture. He described the incredible feats of agricultural inventiveness and creativity that the Jews had performed in Palestine. And he also described how the Jews paid Arabs to endowed Arab farms, and they created irrigation systems that helped everybody in the country. And it's a very vivid and dramatic picture. We're more dependent on Israel than Israel is on the United States. Hard to believe, but it is true. There are 100,000 Israelis in Silicon Valley. They are vital roles in all our companies. In Israel, for Intel's major factory is in Kiryat Gat in Israel. Israelis have produced many of the leading microprocessors that made Intel one of the world's leading semiconductor companies. It was the leading one until recently. The story of Israel is strangely not told because Jews don't want to, attract attention to the incredible feats. Israel almost died. In 1985, Israeli socialism had reached the end of the line, and they were having inflation rates close to 1,000% in 1985. And it was a terrible crisis. They had a joint government, and Bibi Netanyahu was brought in as finance minister and really developed the free enterprise system of Israel that now leads the world in productivity and creativity and invention and in defense. The Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, Iron Beam even. They're going to be zapping missiles out of the sky with laser beams. That's why I felt I had to tell the story of the Israel test.
This is a remarkable history, and I'd love to dig a little bit more into the transformation from socialism and why Israel was essentially functioning on socialism from its early days until the 80s.
There is this romance of the kibbutz, and that Israeli socialism actually worked for agriculture. It was essentially collectives did kind of function in the early years. As soon as, they had to deal with millions of people, and millions of people cannot be organized with a totalitarian or a socialist regime. It just leads to poverty and waste, and what we've learned around the world since 1948 is that communism just doesn't work.
In the book, you talk about the false apartheid claim, and you alluded to this earlier, George Gilder, that Israeli wealth causes Palestinian misery. I'd love to dispel that once and for all because it's simply not true.
Since Israel was created, despite 6 wars, 6 invasions, Israelis have accommodated in Israel so 1,200,000 Arabs who are some of the richest Arabs in the world. They partake of this world's fastest growing and most inventive economy. Lifespans are now average 77 years compared to 30 years when the Jews came to the desert of Palestine in the mid-19th century. It's really this fanatical failure of the Israel test, this UN-financed victim mentality that's been instilled in the Palestinians to make them think that Israeli success somehow came at their expense, that it was a Nakba, although it made possible their lives and prosperity.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with George Gilder in just a moment.
Online at schillingshow.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
SchillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
SchillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit SchillingShowMedia.com. That's SchillingShowMedia.com.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
We continue now on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Our guest is author George Gilder. The new book is The Israel Test, How Israel's Genius Enriches and Challenges the World. There's a subject that you talk about in the book which is really interesting to me, and it's the intellectual superiority of the Jews. And we saw other authors go down this road with different groups of people to great consternation, but you tell the truth about this. Would you explain?
Today, the world is led by Jews. The intellectual world is really dominated by Jews. Half the Nobel Prizes are earned by Jews. Half of the world's leading businesses with the highest market caps, Amazon and Apple was half started by a Jew and a Lebanese. And Google, most of the richest people in the world are Jews. It's just a fact that the world is dependent on a few minorities that make tremendous accomplishments. Thomas Sowell pointed out that the overseas Chinese, these are settlements of Chinese all over Asia, have a similar productivity and creativity. Wherever they go, they dominate the economy. And they suffer pogroms in the same way. People assume that their riches somehow came at the expense of others. And it's the great, deadly illusion of people who fail their Israel test, who imagine that a country that prospers must be predatory.
Then we should talk about the plague of anti-Semitism that has arisen its ugly head in the United States of America most recently. Took a lot of people by surprise. What is at the root of that?
Socialism. The U.S. economy is functioning less well during this period. You know, we're spending an estimated $3 trillion, Janet Yellen declared the other day, on responding to climate change. And windmills and solar panels do nothing to affect the climate, but they waste tremendous amounts of resources. And we're just devoting our economy to futile and unproductive things. There's a hypertrophy of finance. We're printing money. We aren't taxing to produce these wasteful things. Printing money, nationalize the banks, We've created an economy where resentment flourishes and scapegoats are desired and sought. Jews, being the most conspicuous wealthy people, are blamed for the malfunctioning of the economy.
So what is to be done about that on the ground level in America, where we're seeing this particularly virulent on college campuses?
The student loan program was an absolute catastrophe. The loan money did not go to educating the students. The loan money went to multiplying administration, and all the colleges, all the campuses are now dominated by administrators, by the DEI bureaucracy that just fosters resentment and consumes resources and means that the students don't learn much. They're being taught mostly useless subjects and learning resentment. You know, a lot of the colleges have simply accepted lots of money from Islamists, and that too has been one of the explanations for the antisemitism. They're brought in lots of full-paying Islamist students to American campuses, and they intimidate the other students.
Let's talk about Israel's culture of life in stark contrast to its neighbors, which seem to celebrate death. This is an important point, and I don't hear it made often enough.
Israel transcends the materialist superstition, you know, the idea that our lives are random and meaningless and based on resources that are running out in a planet that's plagued by human life. Israel shows that the planet is superabundant, that a desert in the Middle East can be made the world's leading country. It destroys all the myths of exploitation and natural resources and all these ideas that wealth comes out of the earth or it's derived from ownership of limited amounts of land and resources. Israel shows that imagination and creativity in the image of your creator is the source of all human prosperity and life. And they choose life in Israel, and they show up a lot of other countries that have failed by comparison.
I'd like also to discuss with you, George, the importance of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has a fascinating background and a history of fighting against terrorists at a very young age. Would you tell us about him and his political ascension?
I want everybody to read the Israel test, but I have to tell you that the greatest book written about Israel and I've ever read, Benjamin Netanyahu's autobiography. It's just a wonderful, thrilling Tom Clancy story of Netanyahu's life and the life of his family and his father and his grandfather. And it's the story of how Israel survived from its crisis in the 1980s and early 90s when it essentially adopted freedom as opposed to socialism and bureaucracy as its organizing principle. It's also a thrilling story, which I tell in the Israel test too. I mean, Netanyahu is a key figure in the Israel test. You know, his rescue of the people in the Sabena airplane, his brother's rescue of more hostages in Uganda and Entebbe. These are stories of swashbuckling and daring do, and also in the wars. Netanyahu was in Sayeret Maikal, I believe that's how it's pronounced, which is the leading unit of intelligence and special forces in Israel. He's the Churchill of our era. He is, you know, Churchill took on the Nazis, and the new Nazis really are the jihadist movement that regards the chief function as killing Jews. I mean, the Palestinians have a law that awards pensions to families in Palestine in proportion to how many Jews they can prove they've killed. This is why this war continues. Israel can save us from this deadly movement, which we experienced in 9/11. I believe the Israeli response may well be successful.
So where does Israel go from here? Certainly quite a history, but there's a lot that lies ahead. What do you see, George?
I see Israel as the leader of the free world. And Netanyahu is really the Churchillian leader of our era. And Israel is addressing the problem of nuclear weapons, which terrify everyone. I believe that Israel has a very good prospect from Iron Dome through Iron Beam of actually developing systems that can neutralize the intercontinental ballistic missile. And I think that will be a tremendous contribution to the world. Today, American companies have laboratories and factories in Israel. I believe that Netanyahu sees the possibility of dealing with China and with Russia. He has a better relationship with those countries than we do. And I think he can help the United States in preventing the outbreak of a really devastating war, which seems to threaten today. So I think Israel has plenty on its plate.
George Gilder, if people want to get a copy of your book, The Israel Test, tell us how, please.
It's available on Amazon and in bookstores. It's The Israel Test, How Israel's Genius Enriches and Challenges the World. And it's available.
It's a remarkable book, and you've done a fantastic job in telling the truth about Israel. George Gilder, thank you for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.